A pleasure to meet all at last, and here we are at it once again with video games that are totally awesome. So with all the things that I've had to talk about, there's one particular series I probably ought to start covering at this very point. And well, no better way to start than right now. I've talked about it before in HJ and Super Graphics even, mostly with the 2024 remake, Dead Rising Deluxe Remastered. But, of course, what I might as well do, since I had covered the remake, is that I could probably follow up by talking about the original series as it currently stands today. There's a total of 5 games that had come out between 2006 and 2017. This was a big point in history in which Capcom did something a bit different than what they had done with most of the other games. They've had a prior history of going way beyond the norm of what games would have been like then. They went so far as coining the term survival horror for Resident Evil, but with Dead Rising, about 10 years after the first Resident Evil game came out, they decided to go with another type of zombie game. One that actually focused mainly on zombie genocide. Yeah, enormous body counts made way by one particular person. A hardcore survivor that is unlike anybody else who would have ever existed in the faces of the zombie apocalypse. Well, as I've discussed before, Frank West, a photojournalist aged 36, in fall of 2006, decides to make his way via helicopter alongside a charter pilot named Ed to the town of Willamette, Colorado. This town was unfortunately being roped off by the National Guard for unexplained reasons. But, even though Frank could have done things the traditional way and just stayed out of the area that's quarantined, he decides to roll in anyways. He's on the verge of looking for a scoop, 3 days worth of coverage, on the likes of a certain unexplained phenomenon that is occurring within the town itself, mainly at the shopping mall. Of course, he gets a bit of a tour from his pilot, where they find some strange things going on. People are being attacked, ripped apart, vehicles are being ravaged, gas stations are exploding. But at it all, there's a huge group of these people going on over to the local mall. The Willamette Parkview Mall is seen as the main location, the primary setting for which that all the events of this game take place. And believe it or not, the idea of the shopping mall in the zombie apocalypse goes all the way back to 1978. Less than 30 years prior, in which that George Romero, the zombie man himself, was famous for not only his quotes known as, "When there's no room in hell, the dead will walk the earth," but he was also famous at that year 1978 in which that the movie Dawn of the Dead became one of the greatest horror films ever made, and also one of the best zombie movies ever made, up there with Night of the Living Dead 1968 and 1985's Day of the Dead. But the thing is that the idea of the shopping mall becoming the primary location or setting for which that the events of the zombie apocalypse begin to turmoil, it happens to be a big cliche in not just zombie related things, but also monster related apocalyptic scenarios as a whole. The shopping mall is seen as a megaplex worth of marketing and all sorts of amenities that the public can gain access to, provided if the apocalypse becomes bad enough in which they need to escape from the confines of the iron grip of terror. And well, in this case though, Frank West jumps off from the helicopter after they've been chased by some nearby military choppers. And while he drops a briefcase, we can't quite tell what exactly it's supposed to be. But when he gets there to the helipad, a guy is waiting for him, as I've said before. This man, whom is up there with Frank West on top of the helipad, will unfortunately play a critical role later in the plot. But it doesn't really matter though, because Frank makes his way down to the security room, then over to the hallway in which that he enters the entrance plaza of the Willamette Parkview Mall. A large group of survivors are essentially barricading the front doors, preventing the zombies from getting in. Yep, Frank learns that these are zombies outside the mall, and that more and more of them had appeared since last night. They're all that's out there, at least according to a nearby survivor. Frank is asked to go pick up some extra furniture and other items needed for the barricade to prevent the zombies from coming in. All the while, there's a elderly woman named Lindsay who is looking for a dog named after Madonna, nonetheless. I mean, this was over 20 years in the future. Of course, Madonna is going to be the name referring to something else nowadays. Imagine if somebody named something after me. Jay Nowak, the name of a pet opossum or something like that. That'd be pretty awesome. Either way you look at it though, when Frank does manage to get to a pile of junk near a gate, an old man's on the other side. Frank goes to take pictures of him, but he freaks out, claiming that he's responsible for this whole mess. Obviously, Frank doesn't know what he's talking about. The old man just walks away without answering any questions or explaining what's going on. But then, trouble happens. Lindsay unfortunately makes one of the dumbest decisions that anyone could have made in an apocalyptic situation. She puts her life on the dog more so than her own and anybody else that's in the building. Essentially, she breaks through the barricade, opens the front door, allows the zombies to barge in, all the while she just goes digging through the crowds to get to Madonna. All the while, zombies actually break in, and when they do, they start munching down all the survivors that are settled around. There's a guy up above whom is yelling at everybody to get up to the stairs. Frank does so, even as the zombies grow in larger numbers and overwhelm everybody in the room. The fact that Frank was able to get to the stairs and nobody else did means he was more than just a simple survivor. You could say he was lucky, or one could say he had the skills to pull this stuff off. According to some lore from various wiki pages and other such information centers, Frank West has had some combat experience over the years, mainly like wrestling. But there comes his famous quote, "I've covered wars, you know." So it goes to show that he has had some experience out on a battlefield or in a war zone where actual combat took place. And you could probably say he might have hitched onto a few different skill sets relating to combat as a result of that. Or maybe his years of experience with combat were more so related to sports, such as wrestling, which he did a pretty good job at over the years. And well, I'll talk a bit more about the wrestling portion of his life in a little while. Anyways though, Frank makes it to the security room. The door is sealed off by the nearby janitor, whom is named Otis. And I will say that one major thing you'll find between the original and the remake is that the remake had vocals for everybody, including the survivors, and even Otis had his own voice actor, but not in the original or the remaster. Which, in a way, the way I see it, the remake did a solid job with giving everybody a voice. Their own individual voice. That's something you could hardly ever pull off in most games. Sometimes actors are recycled every which way, and sometimes they hardly have any other actors at all. But either way you look at it though, to have TJ Rotolo as Frank West was a pretty unique move, despite the fact that he grew to be pretty elderly by this point. It would explain why he didn't show up for the remake last year. But it's excusable. We did get the actor from Frank West from Dead Rising 4 to return to portray him in this remake. Anyways though, discussions are made and Frank eventually decides to go out through the air ducts, which lead to the roof of the mall, much like Brad himself did. Brad is revealed to be the man whom yelled back at the entrance plaza. I mean, he was wearing a certain attire, as well as Jessica McCartney. These two people, of course, were what Frank came to know as agents. And well, Homeland Security was in on this whole thing just as well. But DHS agents, unfortunately, would not be enough to deal with the problem at hand. That part comes later, though. For when Frank decides to go onto the rooftop and eventually take the elevator down to the nearby warehouse that leads to Paradise Plaza, which is one of the main plazas inside the mall itself. Upon getting to the door, though, to Paradise Plaza, he grabs a fire extinguisher, fearing that somebody's behind him, pursues to attack, but unfortunately it's just Jessie. She sprains her leg upon falling, which means she cannot go after Brad, whom was the guy we saw before. Frank volunteers to do it for her because of her leg injury, even taking her gun with him. So, once the deal is settled, he goes to the food court, which he has to go through Paradise Plaza, then out the door into Leisure Park, and then proceed all the way towards the northwestern portion of the building, which of course is the food court. The food court is where a gunner is at. And well, remember when I said that guy on the rooftop would play a critical role in the story later on? Well, this is actually one of those parts. He had gone from a guy who was talking to Frank earlier to being a guy who was now shooting at Frank. Almost like he didn't recognize him. Either way you look at it though, he's got Brad and Frank to deal with. Because eventually the two work out a deal in which that they need to take down Carlito. And while he is wielding a P90, the two basically have standard pistols. Possibly Glocks. But in any case though, this is one of the first boss fights, or psychopath boss fights, that we have here. Psychopath just happens to be their reference to a boss in this situation. While boss is the more preliminary term, or pseudonym commonly given to that of an in-game character that is hard to beat, thereby calling it a boss character. A character that's higher than most other enemies in the game. It's psychopath that's ultimately used to describe a person whom is hard to beat. And you're not exactly far off here. Carlito is shooting those guys up with a freaking SMG. Of course he's psycho in that instance. So the term does make sense in this context. And it actually does carry on over to everything else. Every boss fight we encounter is simply labeled as a psychopath fight, which does work in this situation, and this was the first time I ever heard of the word psychopath to begin with. Anyways though, once we shoot him down well enough, and he takes a lot of bullets, not very realistic, but it's just a game. What can you do about it? But he manages to escape, leaving Frank and Brad wondering where the heck he went, and also Frank is practically hanging on the ropes, wondering what is going on. Even though Brad, unfortunately, is not willing to tell him, Frank is holding some evidence in his camera. An old man he found at the entrance plaza earlier that day. Brad, unfortunately, is what you might say blackmailed into working with Frank, and Frank working with him. The two basically have their own alliance in that moment to ensure that Frank not only gets what he's looking for his scoop, but Brad obtains to find answers just as well for what's going on at the Willamette Parkview Mall. What does this guy whom we're shooting at them have to do with this? Why is there zombies in the mall now? And all that other stuff. There's probably a big connection in hand with the old man as well. So they proceed to go try and find the old man, going through the legs of the food court and out into Al Fresco Plaza, which is mostly outdoors, much like Leisure Park, but does have its own variety of indoor parts, including some hardware stores, jewelry stores, a fitness center, and whatnot. And then we go back into the entrance plaza. This is one of the only times in which we'll ever get to access the entrance plaza. We have to go through Paradise Plaza, Leisure Park, Food Court, Al Fresco, and then to the entrance plaza. There is another gate in which that you can use to access the entrance plaza from Paradise Plaza, but unfortunately it remains shut for the time being. But you know what though? Just to know the fact that we're back at the entrance plaza within only an hour of which into the game, after what had happened before with Lindsay and Madonna, Really goes to show that we truly are in quite the predicament here. Frank and Brad, of course, are able to get to the Everybody Loves Books bookstore, in which that they find the old man who's named Dr. Barnaby. And he, of course, does have something to do with this, but unfortunately he's unwilling to cooperate with them, turning down Brad's offer for protection until he can guarantee a safe route out of the mall and out of the town of Willamette, Colorado entirely. So, while Barnaby basically seals himself in the bookstore, locking the door and the gates behind him, Brad and Frank decide to go back to the security room and try to figure out a plan, how to get Barnaby out of there, and also how to bring down this other guy whom was shooting at them earlier. Unfortunately, when they do so, Jesse is unable to make a call to DHS security or even do anything else relating to the phone networks. It seems that there was some sort of problem going on with the cell system. Almost like something was being jammed. We'll get back to that later. Anyways, though, Frank can optionally turn in, but not for the whole night, wildly enough. There is lore going on that he's supposedly able to go for the full 72-hour run that this whole game allows us to do. It's not in real time, of course. It passes by a lot quicker than that. Most of us can finish the 72-hour runtime in-game within less than 5 hours of time, meaning that 72 hours in-game would pretty much equate to a good 5 hours worth of real-life time. And in essence, this would mean more than 10 in-game hours would pass before 1 full hour of real time passes. So, I will say that it's a pretty good effort as it means to speed up the in-game runtime, so that way it allows for people to not feel bored or anything. But then again, we might as well talk a bit about how taking down the zombies works here. Of course, it is an optional thing to do here, but that's part of the fun of it. To kill all the zombies in your wake, in your path, or otherwise, it's just too fun not to do here. The extreme blood and gore, slashing off the limbs, and even full-on decapitation. It's just part of the fun that goes on. It's part of that exploitation that goes down, in which that sex or violence is often depicted in various media as a means to gain a drastic appeal for most adults. I myself was, believe it or not, only 11 when I first played this game. And I really got to hand it to an old therapist of mine. I bought the game from him for $10. That's what I did. I get a lot of paid work back then, mostly done within this house. But even outside of this house, I have done work that paid me real money, and not just some incentive that I would get from my parents or whatnot. Anyways, though, that's just really a big part of the fun in this game here. Not just the unique storyline and the memorable characters within, but also the creativity in this game that goes from killing the massive amounts of zombies, whether it be from blades or bats or lawnmowers or shopping carts or, I mean, would you believe you can even use toys to beat up the zombies? I mean, come on. You got a glowing energy sword. And of course it's not going to do much to a zombie. It's a piece of plastic. Oh, but it gets even more weird from there. How about a bottle of shampoo? Oh man. I would almost get the feeling you'd have to squirt it at the zombies. But no, you whack it on them. Like whacking a newspaper on a naughty dog. I don't know what could get any more ridiculous than that. No, but let's be real though. There are still a lot of useful weapons in this game just as well. You have garden shears, you have pickaxes, you have shovels, sledgehammers, pipes, 2x4s, chainsaws, weed hackers, augers, and many other things in there. Of course you gotta have guns in a zombie apocalypse. And well, this is where I could probably talk a bit more about the psychopaths. There is the guy Carlito, whom we fought at the food court earlier along with Brad, but there's many others along the way, most of which are optional boss fights that you can engage in. Other psychopaths, of course, will include a gun shop owner named Cletus Sampson, whom shot a guy named James Ramsey point blank in the chest with a 12 gauge. Woo! All because he was some dirty redneck who had no trust over anybody, regardless of the situation. Man, at least Frank beats some sense into him by shooting him down from a distance, and he gets pretty darn cowardly. That's quite a move to make. Even worse when he just goes right into a zombie, and the zombie bear hugs him and starts chowing down. Like I said, there's ridiculousness all over the place here. It's like the game is a combination of ingenious creativity and a freaking fever dream. But again, that's just part of the fun of this whole thing entirely. Other optional boss fights that you can get involved in will include a former Vietnam War veteran known as Cliff Hudson, whom unfortunately suffered PTSD after watching his granddaughter get eaten alive by the zombies, and started to put him through the days in which that he was hunting down guerrilla warriors in the jungles of Vietnam. There was also the case in which that, let's just say, it gets a little out of the ordinary. The ridiculousness truly starts when we start talking about other psychopaths in the game, like Adam. Oh man, this was one of the first times that I ever saw a killer clown. I mean, the killer clown cliche has been around for a long time, mostly made possible by the real-life infamous serial killer known as John Gacy. But let's be real here. The killer clown was truly made popular in pop culture because of Stephen King's It. And Dead Rising having their own killer clown, of course, was going to be no surprise. And this, of course, would, believe it or not be the last time that we would see a killer clown in Dead Rising, as the sequels would start having that just as well. Well, but it gets even more incredible when you find out this clown is wielding chainsaws. Oh man, and he juggles them like it's nobody's business. I'm surprised he can still keep a hold of those things, let alone not worry about cutting himself open with those. Either way you look at it though, Dead Rising is already probably one of the best games ever made. And being almost 20 years now, I almost wonder why they didn't wait to make the remake in 2026. That would have been the perfect timing for it. The game itself would have turned 20 years old then. But hey, let's continue with the story, shall we? As we continue forward with the story, especially after defeating Adam, if we even bother tacking on that side quest, well, the thing is that as the case keeps on going and the following morning commences, Dr. Barnaby is discovered to be in the entrance plaza. Brad and Frank end up going after him, only to be ambushed by Carlito. Yeah, as we learned from before, he was the guy who was shooting him down in the food court, and now he's back, wielding a sniper rifle. So, quite a change of pace. Taking pot shots at the two. Even worse, you got the zombies around as well. The fact is that Barnaby is unconscious and is technically being lowered down so that the zombies could feast onto him, which could be really bad news down the line. They won't know what truly happened, and a lot of things just won't progress. So the main mission here is to defeat Carlito the second time, and in doing so, Brad unfortunately gets shot. Yeah. What do you know? A pistol shootout between the two, and both get hit. Brad is in the leg, Carlito's in the shoulder, and while he manages to escape, Brad can't exactly do much. It's incredible how he's able to limp all the way back to the security room with the zombies all around. The fact that they spare us the agony of carrying Dr. Barnaby around while trying to protect Brad really is something that I feel like would not have been worth it at all. So we're glad that Capcom made the decision to just skip to the next cutscene, where it jump cuts to the security room. Barnaby is discovered to have sedatives in him, and he won't be waking up anytime soon. Brad, thankfully, is tended to by Jessie, but she tells Frank that due to the bullet wound he obtained, there was a lot of bleeding, which she managed to stop easily, but one thing that's not really easy to do is to prevent a massive fever that he is now getting as a result of inflammation. So, Frank now has to go all the way to Sion's grocery store in the North Plaza to pick up some medicine. Like I've said though, with many more optional side quests that go around, including survivor rescues, psychopath battles, as well as many other things, you'll have a lot of time on your hands. But be careful though, not all of these quests are infinite, and there is basically a color timer, so to speak, in which that it goes from bright green to a dark red. Along with the fact that it sort of fills up like a loading gauge. That it goes from the right to the left, meaning you're out of time. And if it happens with the main case files, then it's pretty much game over. But it doesn't exactly penalize you by bringing you to your last save point or whatnot. It's more of an option that you can do to load your last save based on the time that you had from the last case file before the truth has vanished into darkness. At least that's how they describe it. If you lose a case file, then that's essentially what goes down. You won't be able to see the true ending or know the facts pertaining to the story and the plot. But of course, if you do want to know about the story and the plot, then you definitely got to keep time track on your hands. You can optionally check time by looking at your watch. Frank's watch does showcase mainly an analog, not digital, as those were still technically standard at the time in 2006. Most digital watches and smartwatches tend to be the top part of what today's society might have. That is, if you even bother using watches anymore. Anyways though, upon getting to Sion's, that's where you find the angry store manager, Steven. He apparently has a woman in the cart, and he yells at Frank, claiming that he is a vandal. He needs to be punished, kicked out of the store basically. So armed with a heavily modified shop cart, and technically having this woman with him as a hostage, as well as a shotgun in hand, he is quite a formidable boss. And I will say that in the deluxe remaster version of Dead Rising, he especially took a lot of pain from me. And this was just one playthrough that I made. I can't imagine that the next time I go and play through this game I might face him again, but he is a required boss, much like the two Carlito fights. And we will get to have more required psychopath fights just as well. I will say Sion, accompanied with the metal music in the background, oh boy, he is quite the psycho. I feel like that's probably what gave Capcom the idea to name bosses psychopaths instead. In any case though, upon deleting him, we get one heck of a cutscene. Clean up Register 6. Famous last words. The woman thankfully gets up and apparently accuses Frank of being responsible for this whole mess. Frank obviously has no idea what she's talking about. It's kind of like what happened with Dr. Barnaby earlier, you know, when he stuck his cane through the gate, accusing Frank of the same sort of thing. Like, it's almost like Frank already was the face of pure blacklisting. Like, they know who he is, and they know to avoid him or blame him for the accident and whatnot. This incident sure was quite an ordeal, but Frank himself knows nothing of it. That's the whole point of him coming to Willamette in the first place. So Frank does go into the back with the pharmacy key, grabs the medicine, heads back, gives Brad the medicine. Eventually we are treated to quite a disturbing piece in the story. Because what happens is that Jesse goes to check on Barnaby again to see if he's awake. Sure enough, he is. And well, it's quite a sickening sight to see. Barnaby is basically turning into one of them. I might as well mention that, well, the woman that we saw in Sion's, her name was Isabella Keyes, the sister of Carlito Keyes, the guy who was fighting against Frank and Brad this whole time. And she is his sister? Yeah, quite a turn of events. But unlike with Carlito, while she does have fight in her, much like he did, Frank does convince her that he is not the enemy in this situation. All he is just a journalist. A guy who's covered wars. As if we really need to hear that line all over again. In any case though, Isabella and Frank, as well as the rest, whom eventually come to terms with one another when Isabella is escorted to the security room after unfortunately getting shot in the arm by Carlito. Just think, Carlito himself got shot, and Brad got shot. Now Isabella got shot. So everybody here is getting shot. So this ain't the era of rap, you guys. This is 2006, a time when YouTube was starting to take over the world. Oh, but even more so, it's just to know the fact that this was quite a big transition from a time where the internet was practically at its infancy into a point where it actually truly took over the entirety of the world. It did so much more than it normally could. Not to mention, this was also the point in which that Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii would begin to come around just as well. Dead Rising came out in 2006. And around the same time, all three of these consoles were practically around in society. Anyways, though, once we get to see what's going on with Dr. Barnaby and that Jessie herself almost got bit, the thing is that Isabella reveals that Barnaby has been infected with parasites. Apparently, when Barnaby somehow gets his senses back, his sense of humanity for the most part, we learn that his projects and scientific exploitation primarily took place in attempting to produce more livestock, as the United States was apparently consuming large quantities of meat. Just think, if Super Size Me spread a lot of public service announcements all over the world for the horrific things that happen in the fast food industry, well, this game seems to invoke a similar level of moral lessons. And the fact is that it's true that tons of meat seems to be consumed. And even today, there's been a good ton of meat coming from lots of animals, and even the likes of tofu and vegan related stuff do get put through just as well. But the thing is that Dr. Barnaby, apart from his experimentation with the likes of livestock, this parasite that he manifested alongside the story of Santa Cabeza was a real eye-opener, not just for Frank, but for everybody else. Us gamers are incredibly conflicted. Just the idea that a parasite is in effect and practically spreading some sort of plague amongst the likes of the United States is one thing, but the fact is that this parasite has evolved to a point where it not only multiplies the level of livestock to cope with the level of meat consumption, but also the fact that this parasite is now mutated to a point in which that it modifies a person's body and mind into the zombies that we now know in this game. That is quite a way to go. Because it's very different from the usual treatment of how zombies are created by a specific type of virus. And here it's a parasite. And in The Last of Us, for instance, it's more of a fungus-related thing. Just think. There's a lot of growing problems in society. And we know pandemics were indefinitely one big part of the slobbering 20s. But seeing that we're more than far past that issue now, some people might wonder exactly what is going to happen in the future as a result of it. But I feel like that's better saved for something else. Barnaby unfortunately does eventually start to show more signs of his zombification amidst the parasitic larvae in the system and has to get shot down. So, Frank takes an up close and personal look at Barnaby's body, and well, the two eventually start to talk things over. Well, the whole rest of the group that we have, Frank, Isabella, Brad, Jessie, even Otis, we basically have quite a lot to take in here. Just that one cutscene alone has invoked so much thought and so much questions that Frank himself is in dire need to find the answers to. That's basically the whole thing about him coming to Willamette, to get this scoop. And it seems like it's really becoming more than just a simple case file for him. In any case, though, time does pass a little bit further before some voices on the intercoms come around. In the same way that we had to escort Isabella to the security room after finding out that she got shot by Carlito, he once again appears with some more messages for his sister. Not just apologizing for what happened to her, but now he is supposedly executing what is known as the last resort. And well, what is this last resort he's talking about? Well, according to Isabella, it's some sort of ulterior motive that Carlito himself has. Apart from this outbreak that occurred with the zombies, and apart from him terrorizing the Willamette Parkview Mall, being chased down and hunted by DHS as well as Frank himself, Carlito apparently planned to blow up the mall if he were cornered. So, just think. He's gone from a gunman to a terrorist and now a suicide bomber. But no, it's no simple suicide bomber case. No, Isabella points out that he planned to flood the mall with flammable gas, and that there's large quantities of those parasitic larvae with the zombie genome that can turn anybody into zombies upon contact. And the thing is that this plan of his is to blow up the mall with the gas to create an explosion powerful enough to send thousands, probably even millions of this larvae into the upper atmosphere, potentially going way beyond the quarantine zone of Willamette, Colorado, thus allowing for more outbreaks to occur across the country and possibly the rest of the world. So, looking at you guys who are still playing Plague Incorporated, well, take a look at this game. We have ourselves quite the dilemma here to deal with. It's one thing that Carlito's brandishing a lot of weaponry and having a lot of spite in humanity for what happened in Santa Cabeza, but this kind of revenge plot is way too far. He plans to blow up an entire mall that possibly has a lot of survivors in it, along with a lot of the zombies in it. But still, the parasites, the larva, it just goes way beyond what any normal terrorist would think about doing. So, a new plan is set in motion here. Frank and Brad attempt to sabotage this plot that Carlito plans to carry out by going to the underground segments of the mall, into the tunnels, into the adjacent parking lots that go to various locations, including Sion's, including the Parkview Plaza, including the Alfresco Plaza, and everything else that's on the underside of the mall. These tunnels are basically meant to act as areas for both maintenance, storage, and other such features. But it also is going to be the spot in which that 5 different bombs are located. Various trucks in which that the tires are slashed. So there was no way that Frank would be able to transport the bombs out by hijacking the trucks. No, so what he's got to do is he's got to go to these trucks individually, pick up the bombs from the back of each one, and load them onto a shopping cart and get away. Meanwhile, Carlito's back again. This time, he is more than just armed. I mean, he's got a truck of his own. And I will say, compared to the other 2 boss fights in which that it was easy to shoot him down from a distance, here, he's got a windshield. The only real way that you can hit him is by hitting him from the side. Preferably with a blunt weapon or even a sharp weapon would work, but crazy as it might seem, the sharp weapons apparently do not work as effectively as the blunt weapons. Like, tell me if that makes any sense. Anyways, though, it's more of an option to defeat Carlito again. The bombs are more of the main focus here. But when we do defeat Carlito, we at least do get a cutscene that does help add things up here, because what happens is that Carlito crashes the truck, flips over, gets ambushed by Brad, chases after him. Frank continues on with collecting the bombs. And when he does get all of them and go back to the entrance, he finds a nearby shopping cart, loads the bombs inside, and runs up there to the upper lot, far away from where any of the gas would have escaped. We do get to see more of Brad versus Carlito here. Carlito once again gets shot. This time it's in the gut. And Brad, unfortunately, while he does seem like he's on the winning side because of his wit and his skill with firearms, Carlito unfortunately turns the tides against him by brandishing a switchblade, stabbing him in the back, and then kicking Brad out the door and locking it behind him. Brad is now trapped outside the storage room, where unfortunately his fate is sealed. He becomes surrounded by more zombies. And he doesn't even have a way to defend himself here. Not even his gun was enough. The explosion happens and all 5 bombs are detonated, and thankfully, no gas is ignited. Frank is able to successfully evade the explosion and then proceed back downwards to find Brad, hopefully to see that he may have defeated Carlito. And well, this is once again something that's a bit disturbing. But at the same time, it's a rather somber feel to it. Something that most people might not really accept or would be pretty hard to adjust to, but it is a necessary point here because in order to have the true ending to something, sometimes sacrifices in the game must be made. Well, Brad unfortunately is found by Frank, badly mutilated by the zombies. And he himself suspects that he's turning, just like Barnaby, just like many others in that mall. Even for me, no matter how many times I played this game, it was quite a sad scene. Brad and Frank practically had some sort of, not just an alliance with each other based on them helping each other out, but also it seemed like they could do a whole lot more outside of this sort of thing. But it doesn't really matter at this point here. At the end of the day, Brad is now one of them, relinquishing his own gun to Frank and letting him know to not tell Jesse about what happened down there. In any case, though, Frank decides to get back to the security room after what has happened here. He does not tell Jesse about what happened to Brad, but only to console her and agree that when Brad takes down Carlito, the case will eventually be closed. Frank will have his scoop, DHS will have apprehended Carlito, and he'll likely be taken in for this type of terrorism. Unfortunately, before any of that stuff happens, though, we do have another problem in hand here. A certain large person is hauling Carlito away pretty much by the legs. Although it's not exactly by his actual legs, but by something attached to him. Well, it apparently takes place underneath Sion's. When Frank goes back down to the underground tunnels, it turns out that this location is a butcher shop. Because after all, when you got yourself a meat and a deli store up above at Sion's, these places do of course need their meat from somewhere. And what better place to get them from than the butcher shop? Carlito was apparently in there as well. His ankle is badly screwed up by a hook where he gets attached to the ceiling by this butcher. And let me tell you about the butcher. If you remember when I talked about Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, you know that between the original / remaster as well as the deluxe version of Dead Rising, the design of the butcher is very different. The biggest thing about the difference in his character design is that Larry Xiang, whom is the name of the butcher by the way, he looks very different in the deluxe version that came out last year because of Chinese censorship. I find it to be ultimately quite ridiculous. That simple censorship apparently allows for the United States version of Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster to have the same sort of character design that they featured in China. Why couldn't they just have the original Larry Xiang design fully restored for the deluxe version and keep it in the United States version? Like, I don't know exactly what it is about Larry Xiang being offensive to China. Like, what exactly is that supposed to mean? He's a butcher. He's a guy who works in a butcher shop underneath the mall. Like, I can't identify any possible racial condescending bits. I don't even know. Either way you look at it, though, Larry Xiong is basically the next psychopath boss fight here. Frank does request to have Carlito, but Larry thinks that he should be cooked first. Frank does not need any of that. He has to go through Larry first before he can get to Carlito. So he does, and I will say that regardless of which version of Dead Rising we play as, Larry, much like Steven, is also a pretty difficult boss to beat against. Because he'll whip out every one of his meat carcasses at you, and eventually he'll grab you by the neck, strap you to a hook, and then slash you with his cleaver. Like, he gives Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre quite a run for his money. In any case, though, once you do beat Larry, I found him to be pretty easy most of the time, because as long as you can avoid a lot of his attacks, especially projectile ones, like when he throws the carcasses as well as blades at you, you'll find little to no problem in defeating him. It's a somewhat anticlimactic death as he just lays there in his dying breath. Meanwhile, Carlito is taken down from the meat hook, detached, and well, he is essentially bleeding to death now because of the wounds he obtained from his ankle from that hook. But before that happens, he and Frank do have a bit of one-on-one time. Probably the only time that it's ever happened here, other than when they were on the helipad. This is where the two basically talk more seriously with one another. And well, it's quite a thing to reckon here, because apart from Carlito admitting to a lot of the things he's had and also insulting the American livestock, claiming that all they care about is feeding their fat bellies. Obviously, Frank is not in the mood for this sort of fun and games that Carlito's trying to pull off here, because we know that he is the man responsible for all this. But at the same time, Carlito had a big motive. His family was practically left out on the streets because of what happened in Santa Cabeza. The United States government supposedly did a lot of things to them. And Dr. Barnaby's experimentation practically went out of control. So, of course, things were going to happen like this. But at least we got to know Carlito in his dying breath. His sister, Isabella, is hopefully in safe hands. And when that's happening, his medallion that he holds in front of him in his own last statements, Pachamama. That's basically what we've heard a few times by this point. Frank is pretty frustrated with this. And well, we do eventually get to find some sort of secret hideout that Carlito himself had made at somewhere inside the North Plaza, nearby the gun shop. So, essentially, this hideout acts as a nice little base of operations other than the security room here, which is good because when Frank goes to Isabella with the medallion in hand, Isabella apparently finds out the code to a certain jamming device. Yeah, you remember when I mentioned that Jesse couldn't contact DHS agencies or anything else because of a blockage? That's apparently what's going on. Carlito installed some sort of signal jammer, a device that prevents any sort of contact from in or out of Willamette. And by logging into his laptop from the hideout, Isabella was able to disable the jammer, thereby allowing Jesse to contact DHS. And when she tells Frank about it, she immediately puts them on her cell phone. After a little bit, though, we're given another cutscene by surprise. Jesse apparently phones into Frank again from the radio, telling him that it's over. HQ has decided to ignore all the knowledge and deny any and all the facts that were put together in the mall in the time that has happened since the outbreak occurred in Willamette. Special forces of the United States government, much like Santa Cabeza, are going to be wiping out the entirety of the mall, inside and out. Zombies, people, everyone. Jesse, however, decides to just simply sit there and wait for the inevitable to take place. Frank, of course, decides to get out in the hideout and try to make his way back to Jesse. And well, we do get ourselves the midnight hour. Special forces come in through the entrance plaza. They rope down to the floor and start gunning down all things that move. The zombies, the survivors, everything goes down. Lots of bullets are riddled all over the place. But of course, that's one of the most incredible things about this game here. Getting to fight these special forces operatives is quite a challenge. I mean, these guys are armored and have some pretty powerful machine guns. You can take down a zombie with only a couple shots of them compared to even the submachine gun, in which it would take more bullets per zombie. But probably the biggest thing about the machine guns here that I find a little weird is that the fact is that they're classified as machine guns, but when you pick them up, they sort of look like an M16 assault rifle, which are usually burst fire. Though some models can, of course, be made for fully automatic. But the thing is that I do not recall an M16 assault rifle holding 100 bullets in a magazine. Not to mention the photo that they used when you select one, and the appearance of it when Frank holds it in his hand. It basically just has the appearance of the M16 as a whole, as standard stock model. No modifications of any sorts here, other than the attachments that they put together, including the flashlights and whatnot. But that's besides the point. We know that it's a game and all, and nothing is supposed to make sense, but really, machine guns, 100 bullets, and it's an M16. I guess we'll never understand why. Anyways though, defeating these operatives do grant us a lot of machine guns and a lot of bullets to deal with. I found you could probably waste over 35 bullets on a single soldier. And no wonder, because these guys have full body armor on. So of course it's going to take a lot of bullets just to put them down. Well, in any case though, a lot of these battles here with the zombies and the soldiers that are randomly gunning down Frank every time they see him, well, it does culminate to Frank eventually getting back onto the rooftops near the security room to the air ducts. He tries to call up Jesse with the sound of gunfire in the background. Well, that's because there was a cutscene with Jesse earlier on that we've seen. What I mean by that is, well, Frank doesn't quite know it, but we do, since we are treated to this cutscene. A few operatives are in the security room. One talks to Jesse, claiming that she did a good deed in calling them in and letting them know what happened, and that she is to come into custody with them, sign up some paperwork, and have a talk with her boss. If she agrees to never let information of Willamette out into the public, she'll be free to leave. But before any of that happens, some noises break out. An operative standing outside the door to the security room goes in and sees Jesse ripping her throat out. Oh man, she's one of them now. I get the feeling that maybe, just like what happened with Barnaby, when he got on top of Jesse, we know there wasn't really any bites or anything that took place, but maybe the parasites happen to be more airborne at this point? I mean, think about it. Barnaby got himself infected despite not being even close to touching the zombies. Jesse got infected despite not being bitten by Barnaby. And I guess we'll have a lot more to talk about regarding the parasitic infection and correlation to bite wounds and whatnot later on, because it gets even more crazy later on in the game. Anyways though, Frank eventually does find whatever's left of Jesse. Her glasses are sitting there. Her phone's on the floor. Her zombified self is close by, thankfully. And if you wanted to, you can take a photo of Jesse, just like you could do with Brad, as a zombie. So they're both zombies now. It seems that every main character we have here, apart from Frank and Isabella, are all zombified here, or dead, from various reasons. Well, in any case though, it's pretty much all downhill from here. A full 12 hours or so would pass from midnight to noon on the day of Friday, September 22nd, 2006. That is the date and time in which that Ed, the helicopter pilot, is supposed to return to Willamette to pick up Frank West from the Parkview Mall itself, on the same helipad of which that they left each other. But in all that stuff that happens, well, it's basically just free time for the most part. There's no side quests that come around. There's no additional missions that happen or anything like that. You could optionally talk with Isabella back at the hideout. But at the real core of all things here, I must say, a note that is left on the desk at the security room where the monitors are, detailing that Otis Washington has now left the building, stolen a helicopter, and hopes to meet Frank West on the other side, where they can probably get together, share a drink or two, and hopefully reunite in a good way. That kind of message, I will say, is done a lot better in the deluxe remastered, because we get to hear a voiceover from the actor that voiced Otis in this game. And like I've said, the addition of the voice actor for Otis Washington, rather than him being silent the whole time, really helps for us to get to know his emotion and his personality a lot better. And when the note is there on the desk for Frank to read, we get to hear this sort of internal monologue that Otis Washington probably would have said to Frank out loud, which would be more dialogue than monologue. It's basically set out to sound like monologue because of the somewhat echo that it shows up. But either way you look at it though, this note is rather wholesome to read here. It shows that Otis at least managed to live through this pandemonium that's gone on, while Jesse and Brad unfortunately succumbed to zombification from the parasites, and many of the others. Carlito died, and many others, unfortunately, have all since gone. But Otis at least made it out in one piece. Having stolen a helicopter and had experience with them means he was more than capable of getting out of there alive. But with Frank, of course, he's just stuck around waiting for his ride to show up. And well, in the wake of dawn shows up that morning in particular, we get ourselves another cutscene. The soldiers are all looking around, finding anything else that moves, and when they find out that most of which that the Parkview Mall has no more zombies or other survivors remaining, we do get ourselves a brief glimpse of another soldier whom is above them in the upper level. He takes off his gas mask, and apparently he's going to be an important part of the story later on. But before that happens though, the real worry that we got to have here is, in addition to facing more soldiers, Frank also has to make it to the helipad on time. We get another cutscene where Ed is shown approaching the mall as we get closer and closer to noon on Friday, September 22nd, 2006. And when it finally happens, hopefully, Frank is up there waiting for him at that time, we are treated to the true ending. Frank West is waiting for him on the helipad. It takes a little while. Ed sees him in the distance with binoculars, gets to the helicopter, goes up towards him. When Frank finally catches a sight of him, he's excited and just starts waving at him, demanding to come on down. So you would think that it would all end all greatly and stuff. Unfortunately, a guest is aboard the helicopter along with Ed and chomps him alive. Somehow a zombie got in there. And unfortunately, Ed is eaten alive, loses control of the helicopter, and crashes into Leisure Park. Frank is devastated by this. The helicopter was his only hope out of there. And now, it's gone. He kneels down, full on defeated. A zombie gets ready to bite him in the neck, but then Isabella comes to the rescue, firing some shots at the zombies that have gotten up into the helipad and coming to Frank's aid just in time to see him collapse. Hours pass before Frank eventually wakes up, in the hideout, of course, along with Isabella. It turns out that, wouldn't you know, apart from him just simply dropping unconscious because of what had happened with the helicopter, Frank got himself infected. Wow. As if things couldn't get any more intense, well, Frank now has himself a time limit, a zombification in which that, unless he finds ingredients and a way to counteract the parasites, prevent them from growing any further and thereby taking more control over his body and mind, he'll turn into one of them. Jesse, Brad, many survivors that he's come to know over the time that he's been in that mall, well, he'll now become one of them, inevitable as it may seem. The light at the end of the tunnel, though, could be drawing near, though, because Isabella has a good list of things for Frank to get. He basically has to bring along a good set of supplies, materials for her to get to work on prepping an antidote. Something that probably might not cure the parasitic larva in his system, but will at least hinder the growth of the larva itself. These parasites, of course, are no joke. It does seem that the infection and cycle varies from person to person, and Frank happens to be one of those who is a lot more resilient against these types of parasitic diseases. And with this being no exception, there's no doubt that a good time limit has been put upon based on how long we have until he zombifies. But with that clock ticking, we ought to get out there and grab those materials. So that's basically what happens here. Overtime, as it's referred to in the zombie games like Dead Rising, is essentially the point that after the true endings commenced, we basically get ourselves an epilogue-like process going on with more cutscenes, more gameplay, and more things to do here and there. It's almost like the free DLC that comes with the game itself. And we know that there's a good amount of games that have come around over the years in which that have their own long-rated epilogue that sort of feels like deluxe content. Remember the good ending with John Marston in Red Dead Redemption 2? Basically what happens is that after Arthur Morgan succumbs to tuberculosis, he basically can't allow John Marston to get away and allow for him and his family to move far away from the likes of the Dutch van der Linde gang. And what happens is that when the likes of Dutch as well as Micah, they both manage to escape while Arthur is just laying there dead, John, Abigail, and Jack Marston eventually are seen after a few years of time had passed, where they eventually try to start again after all the trouble that's happened with the van der Linde gang and the death of Arthur Morgan, of course. But that, of course, is just one of a few endings that the game itself truly shows. But it definitely is a pretty big example of what a long-term epilogue was like. I must have played like 9 hours of gameplay between the time that the ending of the game came in with Arthur's death and the time that the true ending of the game, where the credits actually started to roll, took place. 9 hours for an epilogue? That's pretty impressive. But anyways, though, with the overtime function and Dead Rising, we could probably expect more or less up to 90 to 120 minutes of gameplay from the time the true ending took place to the time in which that the actual true ending takes place, in which that after the likes of materials have been gathered, Frank does go out to grab some queens, but in the process of doing so, he finds the remains of the helicopter near the clock tower. A big hole was made after the crash happened. And what he finds inside is some sort of cavern, an underground network of tunnels that could actually lead outside the mall and potentially outside Willamette, Colorado, thereby allowing them to escape. So Frank decides to tell Isabella about this after getting enough queens for her, in which case we only need 10 for the dosage that she plans to give to him. And well, a fateful moment comes. In addition to prepping a needle worth of solution for her to inject into him, thereby allowing him to temporarily cease the process of the parasitic larvae growth in his body, preventing zombification for a little while at least. There was also an anti-zombie spray that she was also able to make with a unique pheromone that was derived directly from the queens themselves. And this pheromone spray, she only has enough for one person worth of dose. And so, When Frank tells her about the crash and about what had happened with the clock tower, this cavern that they discovered, they decide to go in with the pheromone in hand. Isabella coats herself with this pheromone, preventing her from getting attacked by the zombies, and potentially making her a unique shield to prevent any of the zombies from attacking Frank in the process. But once they do travel down to these caverns, deep into these underground tunnels, there's a lot of gates that we need to open here, and it's a lot of co-op-like challenges that come around. But there's also a good amount of rocks that we can use as weapons against the zombies. And I will say that with a variety of weapons in hand that are outside the usual picks for most people in a zombie apocalyptic situation, rocks probably aren't the most practical way of using things here, but they still are effective weapons at bashing undead skulls. In the same way that people have used rocks to actually break other people's skulls before. Yeah, it kind of all depends on what the mishap is like. Anyways though, once we get far enough into these caverns, we can also use the queens as weapons against the zombies because, as we did see from an earlier cutscene in the game, Frank is able to use the queens against the zombies. By destroying one of them, it allows the zombies within a certain radius to all convulse and explode. Most likely because of the fact that the pheromones generated by the queens themselves allow for communication with the larvae, and that when the queen is destroyed, all the zombies that possess these larvae essentially explode. Because most likely the larvae themselves are destroyed or collapsed, basically. Some might think it's relative to that of combustion, but really, this is one of those other unexplained phenomenon that's a bit hard to understand for most, but for some of us, experts in the Dead Rising series, it's pretty easy for us to figure that out. And more importantly, to explain so that anyone else who doesn't know will now know of how it all works. But in any case though, after some distance in the caverns, Isabella finds out that the pheromone's starting to wear off. And what's more is that there's now a locked gate ahead, unlike with the other gates in which that they could simply open with a turnstile wheel. This one has to be operated by flicking some switches. And there's also soldiers in the area too. However, Frank decides to formulate a plan in which that they can open the gates by flicking these switches, allowing the soldiers to be distracted, and they can hijack the nearby vehicle, an MG truck that is sitting outside. Once they do so, they make their way onto some sort of battlefield, basically. I don't know exactly what it has to do with escaping Willamette, but it is apparently yet another setting that just happens to be around. And what's more is that there's now a tank. Holy crap. As if anything couldn't even get any more crazier here. Oh, but you know what though? At least this is a unique final boss battle that takes place. But like some games that we know, this is a multi-phase boss fight. This psychopath boss fight here is not only a tank, which as long as you keep firing at those blinking green strobe lights in the front of the tank, it'll be pretty easy to take down. Also make sure to shoot down the homing missiles that it fires every now and then so you don't get hit. But a cutscene later, we are told that same guy who lifted up his gas mask earlier is now operating the tank. These automated machines are no use at all on the battlefield. Switching to manual control allows for him to directly make contact with the MG truck, causing it to flip onto its side, and Frank and Isabella, unfortunately, are dazed by this crash. Frank is able to get out of there, but when the operator of the tank, whom is revealed to be the leader of the Special Forces, Brock Mason, he decides to aim the tank at Frank. The main cannon is pointed right at his face, and man, Frank is so screwed here. He and Mason decide to have a little one-on-one together. At first, Brock has a lot of questions and a lot of things to say to Frank regarding all the stuff that's happened. He tries to find out where Frank was hiding when his men mopped up the mall, and of course, the fact that this whole thing about the zombie outbreak and all that was just some sort of mission. It wasn't just Santa Cabeza, but that whole thing about Willamette's problems was all just some simple set of missions that he intends to carry out here. You see, he practically led the assault on Santa Cabeza. This cleanup operation that he led out to really was enough to set Frank off. Frank himself truly did not believe that the people of Santa Cabeza needed to be tarnished by the likes of the government's iron grip. Because of some experimentations and because of some certain ideologies that just unfold, Frank himself is now starting to feel that not only is Isabella in trouble here, but a lot more people if this Brock Mason guy isn't put down in the face of justice. So, that's what happens here. Brock decides to look around to him, letting his guard down and having some sort of cigar in his mouth. Frank slug punches him, knocking the cigar out of him, and well, the two face down. This is the true final boss. Unfortunately, Frank is completely unarmed. There's no weapons to take a hold of here, just his fists. Although one other tip that I can offer to any players who haven't played Dead Rising yet is that if you're up against Brock Mason, unarmed, jump kick him multiple times. A lot of times when you do so and you go in a figure eight motion, constantly jump kicking him, he'll have a pretty hard time trying to hit you, and more so if he tries to pull off one of those combos that stuns you temporarily like some psychopaths do, then well, it'll be a pretty easy cinch here. But the real problem, apart from him punching the crap out of you, will be that you'll fall off the tank and large groups of zombies are coming after you after all. So that's one other thing to keep in mind here. In any case though, it's quite a lot of effort here. Appropriately enough, considering that this is the final ever boss fight in the entire game. But when you finally do it, we see the face of defeat. And it's quite amazing to see the main guy in the government defeated by a photojournalist, falling backwards and getting caught by the zombies. Oh man. It's definitely not like any of those rock concerts you might have been to where the singer will jump up hoping that the audience will catch him. No, man. These audience members that came to see the fight are going to eat the loser alive. And I'd say that is one hell of a conclusion. Oh, but they don't just stop there. You got Isabella trying to fend off the zombies as they are trying to flip over the MG truck that she's still standing on. And Frank is just there on all fours. Not only the fact that he learned the truth about what happened from the perspective of Brock, but also just the fact that everything that had happened in the 72 plus hours that he had spent in Willamette really did open his eyes to the faces of reality. The facts that were spoiled out and leaked, the conspiracy that had happened here, all in all, with the government that tried to shut down all the likes of these investigations, they more than failed because their main man is out of commission now, thanks to Frank's combat skills. So, with a mighty roar, he yells at the sky, proving once and for all that he's no ordinary survivor. He is Frank West. As the game conclusifies with a few walls of text explaining that Frank had the case under his own belt, and even with the infamous ending text in red that shows Carlito had complained his belly was not full. Right then and there, that's video game history in a nutshell. If you thought Resident Evil was practically groundbreaking for what it did in the faces of zombie games, well, Dead Rising did something way more than the average zombie game could possibly do so. This wasn't just about a game with incredibly high body counts in which that even Left 4 Dead would have to turn their eyes over to this franchise, but the success of the first Dead Rising game led to multiple sequels, some requels, and then of course there was the more recent deluxe remaster of the first game. But apart from that, this whole thing was probably one of the best things I'd ever seen in my life. And I've seen so many zombie games over the years, it's probably not even that funny. Not just for console releases, but also PC releases like Flash games. I could talk about the SAS Zombie Assault series, or even the likes of the Road of the Dead series, but I feel like those would be better saved for some other point in time. So, Dead Rising Part 1. Whether it be the original from 2006 or the 2016 remaster, which was mainly made possible for the likes of modern consoles, mainly Generation 8 consoles like the Xbox One and PS4, Dead Rising Part 1 did such a fantastic job. I almost feel like that it has sort of the groundbreaking effects as Toy Story did. Like Toy Story, Dead Rising had quite a compelling series of stories, soundtracks, memorable characters to get to know about and root for or feel bad about whenever something happens to them. And on top of the many other things that take place here, much like Toy Story, Dead Rising Part 1 truly holds a special place in the hearts of so many people right now. And the fact that we have another Dead Rising game, a deluxe version of the original, which not only fully refurbished the game with some brand new graphical capabilities, but also a new set of voice actors, as well as some other new stuff, it's safe to say that the first game has been that big of an effect on society. In the faces of gaming, especially when we're at a point in time where M-rated games were more than just the norm by the year 2006. This led to probably not that many people making fun of it or being rude about it, but I'm sure that with parents of all sorts, you might have some things to say about a game with endless bloodbaths, crazy clowns, and horrific government agents trying to shut down photojournalism. You know, there's a lot of things that go on here. A lot of satire, some political things here and there, and some governmental conspiracy. But at the end of the day, that's what makes this game more than just a simple masterpiece by Capcom. And for that reason, let's go ahead and give it a big scoring here. Probably a little too high for what it is, but 9.4 out of 10.1. That's ultimately the scoring that I've given to the first game here. But if you thought that it was over with this, just hold on a bit, because I will have more to say later on, as I will be talking about some of the other Dead Rising games. So, with that in mind, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.